Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if the words you read actually change how your brain works, right at that moment? Well, this new study dives deep into that with some really cool science. Imagine reading a sentence. Some words are super expected, like D or A, while others might be a surprise. This study explores how that surprise, what scientists call surprisal, affects how we process words as we read them. It's like a measure of how unexpected a word is and how much work our brain has to do to understand it. The big question here is the shape of the relationship. Is it a straight line? Does it curve? And importantly, does this surprise directly tell us about the cost to our brain? Or is it just how our measurement tools like eye tracking or brain scans happen to show us things? The researchers wanted to figure out the formula connecting word surprise to what we can actually measure when people read. So how did they test this? They looked at two big collections of data. One from Dutch readers where they tracked both their eye movements and their brain activity EEG at the same time. Pretty neat, right? The other was a big English data set that had lots of different ways of measuring reading. They used eye movements, how fast people read word by word, and brain signals called ERPs. They took all this information and fed it into their models. Their main tool for this was looking at surprise raised to a certain power, like s to the power of alpha. If alpha is 1, that is just normal surprise. If it is less than 1, it is like a sublinear effect, and if it is more than 1, it is superlinear. They tested a whole bunch of these powers, from small numbers all the way up to 2.5. to see which one best predicted what they were measuring. They used a clever method called cross-validation, which is like testing their model on data it hasn't seen before to make sure it is really working and not just memorizing. First off, good news for the idea that surprise matters. Across the board, surprise was a really good predictor of how people processed words. For nearly everything they measured in Dutch, and most things in English, more surprising words led to longer reading times or different brain signals. This tells us that surprise is definitely a key player in how we understand language. Now, for the really interesting part, while surprise predicted things when they really dug into the math and made sure they were comparing apples to apples, especially with words of different types and how common they are. The Dutch data showed that a simple, straightforward relationship with surprise, a linear one, where alpha equals 1, was basically just as good as any fancy curved relationship. The fancy powers didn't give them a big enough win in their prediction tests to be considered clearly better. This means that for those Dutch readers, the surprise of a word seemed to affect their reading in a straightforward, predictable way, without needing a complex mathematical curve to describe it. The English data was a bit different. Some of their reading time measures, especially when they used a specific type of model that is good for time measurements, did seem to favor those fancier power exponents. For example, for first fixation duration, the best fitting power was quite high, suggesting a superlinear relationship. However, this was very dependent on the exact model they used. When they tried other ways of modeling the data or looked at brain signals like the N400 and P600, the evidence for a distinctly different power than 1 wasn't as strong. So what does this all mean? The researchers are saying that surprise is definitely a big deal in how we process language, but, and this is a crucial but, we have to be careful. The shape of that relationship isn't always clear, cut, and it can depend on what we're measuring and how we're measuring it. They're emphasizing that just looking at the best number for a power, a point estimate, isn't enough. We need to look at how good that number actually is at predicting new data, and how much better it is than the simple, straightforward case. In many cases, the simple case ordinary surprisal was good enough and protected by uncertainty. This is a super important point they're making. The exponent they find isn't necessarily painting a direct picture of how much mental effort a word takes. It is more about how that surprise is expressed in the measurements they took, like how long eyes lingered on a word or how a brain signal changed. It's like this: if you measure a plant's height, that is an observation. But the growth rate, how fast it is growing, that is a little more complex. The exponent they find is more like the growth rate of the observation, not necessarily the direct amount of work the plant is doing. The Dutch data is really interesting because it matches up with previous research suggesting that ordinary surprisal, with that power of 1, is a really solid way to predict reading behavior. It's like a go-to explanation that often works really well. The English results, where some reading time models did pick different powers, are also telling. It is not necessarily that the linear theory is wrong, but that how we measure things, the scale we're using, can make a difference. If you are measuring height with a wooden ruler versus a laser scanner, you might get slightly different readings or best fit descriptions, even if the actual object is the same. This means we need to be careful when interpreting those results. They also looked at brainwaves, specifically N400 and P600. These are like electrical signals in the brain that show up when we process language. The N400 is often linked to understanding the meaning of words and how they fit into the sentence, while the P600 is more associated with grammatical processing. The study found that while surprise might affect both, the evidence didn't strongly suggest they follow the exact same mathematical pattern or exponent when responding to surprises. This makes sense because they are thought to reflect slightly different cognitive processes. Something else they did, especially in the English part, was compare different ways of calculating surprise, from older methods based on word counts to newer ones from sophisticated AI language models. They found that to make a fair comparison, you have to use the exact same words and data points for every method. Otherwise, differences might just be because one method looked at easier words than another. This is a crucial point for anyone building or using these language models for research. Here is a limitation they clearly state. They looked at how surprise relates to the observed measurement like reading time, but they can't fully untangle that from how that measurement is made. For example, a really surprising word might cause a lot of cognitive work, but is the reading time directly proportional to that work? Or does the act of moving your eyes and making a decision add its own layer of complexity? This study, they admit, focuses on the combined effect, not just the pure cognitive cost. The Dutch data really stands out as the most cautious result, when they made sure they were only looking at the important content words and accounted for how common those words are in Dutch. The simplest model, ordinary Surprisal, held its own. It wasn't really beaten by any complex curve. This suggests that for this rich co-registered data, a straightforward, linear relationship with Surprisal is a very strong contender. The English data, on the other hand, did show some situations where a different power might be slightly better, particularly with reading times. But, and this is important, it seemed to depend heavily on how they modeled those reading times. When they used different statistical tools for the reading times, the evidence for a nonlinear relationship wasn't always as strong. So, what is the big takeaway here? Surprise is undeniably important for how we understand language. It consistently predicts how we read and react. However, when we try to precisely define the mathematical relationship between that surprise and what we can measure, like reading speed or brainwaves, things get complicated. The shape of this relationship, the exponent they talked about, is really about how surprise shows up in our measurements, not necessarily a direct window into the pure mental effort involved. The authors are being really careful and modest here. They're not claiming to have figured out the ultimate formula for how brains process surprise. Instead, they're showing that even after trying to control for a lot of tricky factors like word types and how common words are, the simplest idea that surprise has a straightforward effect is surprisingly tough to beat. It is a strong baseline that needs a lot of evidence to overturn. Their safest conclusion is that surprise is a reliable and important factor. But if you want to claim that the relationship between surprise and reading has a specific, non-straightforward shape, you need really strong evidence from tests that look at that prediction, control for other influences, and consider how the measurement itself might be affecting the outcome. It means we can't just look at a single number and declare a finding. In short, surprise matters, but the detailed mathematical relationship is nuanced and dependent on the measurement. They advise us to think of ordinary Surprisal, that unit exponent, as a really strong default that is hard to displace with more complex models unless there is clear benefit in prediction and careful statistical checks. This research is really cool because it tackles a fundamental question in how we understand language. It shows that our brains are constantly making predictions, and when those predictions are off, when something is surprising, it changes how we process information. The study's strength is in its rigorous approach, using multiple datasets and careful statistical methods to avoid drawing conclusions too quickly. It highlights that scientific interpretation isn't just about finding a number, but understanding the uncertainty around that number and how it relates to the actual phenomenon we're trying to understand. What I find so fascinating is the emphasis on observation scale linking functions. It's a reminder that our scientific tools, whether it's asking people to read or measuring their brainwaves, are not perfect reflections of internal mental processes. They are themselves complex systems with their own characteristics. So, when we see a pattern, we have to ask, is this pattern in the mind or the way we're looking at the mind? This study leans towards the latter, urging caution and more sophisticated analysis. The implications for understanding language are significant. Knowing how surprise affects processing helps us build better language models, understand how people learn languages, and even how we deal with ambiguity in sentences. While this study didn't definitively prove a complex curved relationship for all measures, it powerfully reinforced that surprise is a core element of language comprehension. For future research, it would be amazing to see studies that combine even more measures, perhaps concurrently tracking eye movements, EEG, and behavioral responses under carefully controlled experimental designs. Also, exploring how different types of surprise, perhaps emotional surprise versus purely statistical surprise, interact with these processing measures could yield further insights. And as language models continue to evolve, testing how these new models' measures of surprise align with human processing across various tasks will be crucial. It's a reminder that science is often about refining our understanding, about asking better questions, and about developing smarter ways to get the answers. This paper has certainly done that for the fascinating world of sentence processing. What do you all think about this? Does it change how you think about reading? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, please give this video a like and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more journeys into the fascinating world of psychology and neuroscience. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.